Thanks so much for submitting your work for your discussion postings. I think you guys have done a great job of engaging this area of literature. I can see that you've thought about how short stories and poetry also kind of express some of those modern impulses and of course the modern subject material. I know that Dakota, you made some good observations when we pulled into the story, right? I would recommend in the future, kind of moving forward, maybe using some of those words to support, much like you did here. Remember, you don't want to use italics when you're kind of putting it into a quote. It doesn't have to be in that form. Um, yeah, that's something to pay attention to as you move forward. As you can see here with Timothy, he mentioned specifically the author and kind of the volume and page number, which is a great way to do that. And poetry is, of course, you use quotations in poetry and short stories. I think it's also a great overview here that Timothy has and many other people have when they put forward their references. So that's a good model to use. Um, Now, as far as kind of that type of work, I think you just want to keep that in focus, right? Um, Timothy, fantastic response back to your peer. Now, getting into the actual kind of meat of the conversation, I really appreciated particularly some of the observations about the actual period, right? That modernism was kind of this explosive and almost um, engaged response to some of the big changes that were happening on the landscape. You know, this notion that the stability we once had was not there is fantastic, and it pulled in a lot of the different authors' perspectives on this writing. Um, you know, in many ways, it's a very psychologically motivated period too. I think many of you mentioned that. Um, Wallace Stevens was a very normal man. He had a normal job and he vacationed in Key West. He was not above it. And so, kind of thinking about his engagement with what was going on and kind of talking and debating through the experiences, that's a great perspective. Um, I also think that, the ideas can kind of cause a little bit of disjuncture, because they are difficult, but yet at the same time, they're supposedly dealing with like everyday subject matter, right? Like capturing the dynamism of a moment, right? And I think we have to always consider what they're trying to do. I think Amanda mentioned like when she was reading, she could connect with some of the impulses in the story, but in other places it's hard to connect to it because it is such a personal but yet kind of powerful moment. Um, and many of you did like Robert Frost, which is good to know. But it's also kind of thinking about like you can appreciate something that you don't enjoy, right? And that is, I think, the key point with literature, and particularly literature on this point, is that there is a depth and a ridge to it. I know that some of you mentioned, particularly with the Flowering Judas story, that Catherine Ann Porter was very symbolic, and that even though you might not have appreciated the story in a way, the symbolism was really powerful. The same thing that you mentioned, in reference to some of the poetry that was being expressed. Um, the idea that what you're seeing on the page is just a mere small percentage of what's actually there is also key. Both Fitzgerald and Hemingway wrote in a style that really did, it's called parataxis or the iceberg theory, that they really wanted to hide the meat of it beneath the story, right? So that you had to reach for it. Same thing with Sherwood Anderson, who also kind of was a mentor of sorts, particularly to Hemingway. And many of you did mention this kind of smallness of the reading, right? That they seem like they knew each other, and maybe we don't have that in this day and age. But there was a much more kind of focus. Um, I think for the most part, you guys have engaged modernism in a way that is apropos. Hemingway is known more for his engagement with the traumatic in the modern period, whereas Fitzgerald is more engaged with the psychologically traumatic And those are two poles that you probably see pulled up a lot in this period. Catherine Ann Porter is, of course, dealing with a very cerebral perspective on trauma and that notion of how do you deal with the thing that you can't make known, the experience that is too much. How do you give presence to something that in its essence is absent? And I think that is key, right? Is a key element to it. And when we're writing in that way, it is hard to write about something that you don't totally own, like a traumatic moment. That's why I think both Robert Frost and E.E. Cummings really tried to kind of capture kind of a quick moment, but also making a critique on that attempt to make it, right? That attempt to make it a plot driven or character driven system. And it wasn't. Um, and most of you did mention that, so I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think that you have all kind of engaged the work well. Now, this week, of course, we are dealing with the midterm. The midterm opened on February 10th, and you'll have this week to complete it. The midterm is through ProctorU, so you will be using that service. So please let me know if you have any questions or if anything kind of comes up. You'll see that the test was made available. The test is going to be under our learning modules, and then under learning module, it's under 6, Unit 6. You will see that there's a little midterm prep, and then there's, of course, the actual midterm. If you look under class discussions and then specifically under the week 6, you will see that there is a study guide that you can download. You can bring this in. The midterm is open book, open note, and you can bring them with you. These are going to be guides that will help you. There is a pool of questions that you could be asked on the midterm. It is a random pool. You'll be asked anywhere from 3 to 5 questions, and I would say, shoot for 2 to 5 paragraphs per question. That is a great way to kind of think about answering that. But complete the study guide, bring it in with you. I will give you extra credit for it. If you missed a homework or you missed like a discussion posting. Also, just to let you know, at the very bottom of the discussion page, there's also the extra credit. And this is a more, I guess you'd say, a bigger amount of points that you can get. This will actually help you with what I call the plus minus bump. So if you're setting at like a C plus, it'll bump you to a B minus. If you're setting at a B, it'll bump you to a B plus. So this is something that can be really helpful too. If you do have questions, let me know. Basically this week we don't have any readings. It's all about the midterm. We'll start our readings back up in week 7 with the Harlem Renaissance, depression literature, and poetry that came from it. And then we'll move through fiction in the 50s, the 60s, and postmodernity, and then we'll be into our final. If you do have questions or things come up, please feel free to reach out. I look forward to chatting with you all soon, and have a great day, a great week, and a great final.